Hey everybody, it's Dr. Eric Balcabbage. We're back for another edition of Thyroid Answers podcast, and we have another guest today. Her name is Hope Pedraza. She is a certified nutrition, diagnostic nutrition coach, right?
Sort of. Certified holistic nutritionist, and I'm a functional diagnostic nutrition practitioner.
I couldn't have said it better myself, right? So, you're on the podcast. Welcome to the Thyroid Answers podcast. As I said, I'm just coming off another hour and a half with another interview, so my brain is still kind of floating around the place. But
yeah,
we met through a fellow thyroid podcaster, Annabelle
yes.
Bateman.
Yes.
And so you said, hey, I think I have some things that I could bring to your audience. And we started talking about what that might be. And we said, hey, minerals, adrenal physiology, the connection. So we haven't really talked about mineral perspective and really and adrenals from that angle.
Yeah.
So we brought you on. So welcome to the Thyroid Answers podcast.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for having me.
You bet. So I guess the first thing to ask is, who the heck is Hope Pedraza, and why should we listen to you, right?
Yeah.
Who are you? Give us your story, your background, how you got into what you're doing, and some of your experience and expertise.
Yeah. So I think my journey into the human body kind of started when I was a kid. I started dancing. My background is in dance. I danced for 20-something years of my life, and that really got me into just the love of movement and the human body, how the human body works. And that got me into Pilates, and eventually I opened my own. I have a brick and mortar Pilates and fitness studio as well, in addition to my online nutrition practice. And kind of throughout that, I also had kind of another path that led me on this path. I dealt with a lot of digestive issues growing up. I had in and out of different doctors and hospitals and colonoscopies and endoscopes, like you name it, all the poking and prodding. You can imagine I had all of that when I was a kid, all for them to, the final doctor to say, oh, you have IBS, which is like, we don't know what it is. Your stomach's messed up, right? So as I got older, I kind of took it upon myself to educate myself, and I taught myself things and learned all the things about nutrition and stuff. And so sometime in my 20s, I decided, after reading some things, I was going to attempt to go plant-based and think like maybe that'll fix things. But somehow by miracle, I healed my IBS. I had terrible allergies. I had allergy shots for probably 20 years. I had terrible allergies. And so just that was kind of a light bulb moment for me, like, okay, like there's something to this, like using nutrition as medicine thing. And so when I had, at the time I had my Pilates studio, and I decided I wanted to kind of create this kind of comprehensive experience for people coming in, right? I wanted them to get their fitness and the nutrition all in one spot. And initially I was kind of doing just basic nutrition coaching, right? And it was mostly women coming to me, and they wanted to, quote, I'm using air quotes here, like lose weight, right? Or they wanted to tone up or drop a few pounds. Mm-hmm. And when working with this women, I'm realizing like there's so many deeper things at play here. Like these women were dealing with, chronic thyroid issues and hormonal issues and gut issues and chronic inflammation. Like there were so many deeper things at play. And I was realizing that the weight they were wanting to lose was really just a side effect of all these other things. And so that led me down to really further my education in nutrition. And so I got my diploma in holistic nutrition, and I did the course to become an FDN, functional diagnostic nutrition practitioner, to really be able to meet people at that like deeper level and get to the root cause, rather than just talking about, calories and macros, because it's only going to get you so far.
Yeah. So it's not unusual, right, that people show up in an office and the game plan is, I want to lose weight. Mm-hmm. Right. And then the thought process is, typically when somebody's overweight, the simple kind of calculation that most people consider is, I eat more calories than I need, and I don't have enough activity for that caloric load. Right. And to some degree, we could say that kind of makes some sense. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. But for a large percentage of people, when we really get granular with what's going on in their life, it doesn't work. Yeah. Right.
There's deeper things going on.
And so what I tell most people is to start, like, how metabolism is supposed to work is that if I eat more calories than I really need, and I'm starting to store extra calories, then my body should be increasing the metabolism to burn those things off. And when I eat fewer calories than my body really needs, then my body slows down the metabolism to
To hold on to.
Right, to conserve energy. Like, hey, I don't have enough energy, food energy here to turn into cell energy, so I'm going to slow down the metabolism so that I can manage the most important pieces of cell physiology.
Yep.
Which then flies in the face of this concept of too many calories in, not enough calories out, right?
Yep.
So how do you, in your mind, kind of rationalize what's going on here? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I really think it's a lot more complex than most people make it out to be. Like the whole calories in, calories out thing, like you're saying, I think it only gets you so far. And, I could be, and the thing is, I have so many women coming to me that are doing all the things. They are eating, so strictly on eating clean, and they're working out and they're doing all the things. Well, then how do you account for those people that are eating exactly, they're working out, they're not overeating, they're not eating a ton of sugar, they're not, so I think it's more complex than people make it out to be. And at that point, I'm looking at, okay, what else is going on? Like what's going on in the body that's making your body hold on to this excess weight, right? And so then we have to look at things going on like deeper under the hood, right? We're looking at the gut and we're looking at the thyroid. And for me, I know we're talking about minerals today, but the mineral balancing is a huge piece, because when the minerals are off, everything is off. I mean, minerals are like what's going on at a cellular level, right? It's like, I know it's always cliche because I say this so many times because I talk about minerals so much, but they're the spark plugs in the body, but they really are. Like nothing is happening in the body without the minerals. And so looking at things as at a cellular level as much as possible to really see what is the real problem, that your metabolism is acting the way it is, or that your body's not functioning as optimally as we would like in terms of, burning calories or holding on to fat or whatever. So I just think it's more complex than people make it out to be, and that there's, chronic inflammation causes a lot of things to go wrong in the body. And that's typically what we got to get to the bottom of.
Yeah. And I think that's sometimes a big disconnect between what we do in more of a functional perspective versus what's done in an allopathic perspective.
Right.
And interviewing medical physicians, you start to have that conversation, like what's the impact on inflammation? Like they kind of look at it like it's, especially when it comes down to the thyroid gland and maybe adrenal function, that it comes down to, is there a disease that's damaged the tissue? And if there isn't a disease that's damaged the tissue, then how are we supposed to know? Right.
Exactly.
And I think that creates a big disconnect between what they're doing and what we're doing, because we're saying, listen, sometimes you don't have a disease yet, but you have dysfunction, and we can see the signs and symptoms of that, and we want to address that
before it gets to that
before it gets there. From the medical perspective, they would argue, but to make a conclusion like your gut physiology might play a role in adrenal physiology, we'd actually have to do a clinical study and get 500 to 1,000 people and see if that's consistent with these 500 to 1,000 people. And that's going to cost us a couple $1 million to do that study. And we don't have the money to do that study. So we really can't even get there. So we're just waiting for the disease state to show up, and then we treat the disease state. So I understand both perspectives, right? Sometimes from a functional medicine perspective, we can look at it like, how can they not see it, right? How can we not? It's right here in the room with us, right? But why don't we act on that? And the answer is because they're following clinical trials, clinical guidelines, and because of just the nature of their industry. But
it's what they were taught. I mean, it's how they were
trained in guidelines,
right?
Which initially I thought was bad, because it's like, how can they not do it? But now I've softened my approach, and I'm like, I think that's okay, because that's their job, is to wait until disease is present, manage it.
Symptoms and surgery. That's what they're trained in. I mean,
So it's not that it's bad. Not everybody wants to do what they need to do to get healthy, but it leaves an avenue for us in functional medicine to be able to say, hey, if you want that kind of crisis care and disease management, you don't have to change anything that you're doing currently, and you can do that. But if you don't want that model, then you have to do things. and we have to uncover what's potentially creating it,
Right.
creating the problem, and that's us. And so
Mhm.
these two worlds can coincide.
Yep.
And probably the bigger part of what our job needs to be is help build that bridge,
Right.
instead
Bridge
of
the gap.
creating the divide, right? And
Yeah.
say,
No,
hey,
I agree.
they're not doing the wrong thing
Yeah.
based on training,
Yeah.
but what they do is different than
What
what
we
we
do.
do.
Yeah.
And we need to make sure that we both understand that. Oh,
Right.
this whole functional nutrition, it helps you, forget that. Drink
Right.
my soda, have my
Yeah.
8 to 11 servings of grains per day. And then we'll deal with the cardiovascular disease later, because that
Yeah.
didn't have any effect with it.
Right. Of course
Right.
not.
But it gives us the room to be able to say, hey, there's different options here.
Right.
There's
Right.
that one and
Right.
this one.
Right.
And so in your world, now that you've got these people coming in, men, women, that are frustrated with weight or tiredness or fatigue and symptoms, you're probably seeing the same thing I am, that they're frustrated in a model that they're looking at and going, why can't you listen and see what's going on here?
Right.
Right. And can somebody
Right.
saying, well, you're just overweight, or you're
Yeah.
just have a
Well,
thyroid
that's
issue.
the
Right.
answer they get. I mean, I work with mostly women, and that's the answer. Because yeah, you're right. I mean, I would say 100% of the women who come to me, it's like they're at the end of the rope. Like, I'm so frustrated with every doctor I've seen. And this isn't to bash all doctors, it's just the experience that the women have coming to me. But I'm frustrated with the response I've gotten. I've been brushed off. I've been, whatever. And that's the answer a lot of them are getting. That's the only response. They're like, well, just lose weight. That would fix it. I have so many women that's the only answer they've ever been given. Well, just lose weight. Like, it's just that easy. Like, let's not look at anything else that's going on, and that's the real problem. And yeah, it is. I mean, they're coming and they're frustrated knowing that there has to be another answer. There has to be another reason why things are going the way they are in my body.
Yeah. And when somebody's overweight, and I think you already kind of allude to it, but I'll let you give the answer to this. Oftentimes, somebody will be told the reason you're unhealthy is because you're overweight.
Right.
I think we have to reverse that.
Mm-hmm.
The reason you're overweight
is because
you were unhealthy first, right? Do you agree with that?
Totally, 100%. Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
Because we all know somebody who eats way more calories and does nothing, and miraculously they're able to maintain their weight,
exactly,
right?
Exactly.
And the person who's doing yoga and exercising and eating a clean diet and doing all the things that seem to be right, they can't manage their weight, right? They've got a weight issue. So I always look at it like you have to have some kind of inflammatory immune issue going on to get overweight in the first place, right? Especially when when you're talking about 5 pounds or so, maybe it's a little slop, but when we're talking about 20, 30 pounds overweight, there's something else going on that's attributing to, I can't burn food energy efficiently and turn it into cell energy. So with your clients, we're going to get into adrenal gland and thyroid physiology, but from a big view, where do you see the connection between adrenal physiology and thyroid physiology? Because, and some people would say, I have a thyroid problem. Other people would say those are symptoms of an adrenal problem. What do you think?
In my experience, you can't have one without the other. I have yet to have a client who comes with me with whatever thyroidism they're dealing with that doesn't also have an adrenal problem. And so, especially when we're talking about hypo, like every client ever, and I can say this honestly, every client that I've ever had that has hypothyroidism, even if it's Hashimoto's, whatever, they're sluggish thyroid, they got sluggish adrenals. Like, it's just, they go hand in hand. So I really don't see the disconnect at all with that. Like, I think they go hand in hand. I think in most cases, I would say 90% of the time, they go together. And this is why I've talked about this on a handful of different podcasts, because I think people separate them, and I just don't think you can address the thyroid without addressing adrenals. Like, I just don't think you can do it.
Yeah, I agree. From my perspective, I always talk about excessive cell stress changes our physiology. And it seems for some, especially maybe from a medical perspective, that seems like a crazy notion. But if you look at the literature, the cells have the ability to monitor the amount of stress that's impacting the physiology. And when cells perceive excessive amount of stress, it changes the physiology of what's the purpose of the systems, right? I usually say that, we have two states, homeostasis and allostasis. Homeostasis is, hey, make enough energy to do everything I need to do. And allostasis is, I don't have enough energy to do everything I need to do, and I need to make adaptations here. And I think the problem many times in allopathic medicine is we're assuming everybody's in homeostasis and they just have a broken thyroid gland or a broken adrenal gland. And oftentimes in functional medicine, we assume what we see going on is broken, right? You have, this is a problem. This is an immune system out of control. I often think in the early phase, and I'd love to get your opinion, especially if it differs, is that what we see in people isn't broken physiology, but it's adaptive physiology. And so given a stress situation, I don't think it's abnormal to see a change in thyroid regulation. I don't think it's abnormal to see a change in adrenal physiology. I don't think it's abnormal to see a change in neurotransmitter physiology. I think those are all adaptive changes to deal with the stress response. What's your take on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I totally agree. I mean, I think that's why so many people can run for so long with, if you want to say, I know some people don't agree with the whole term of adrenal fatigue, but like for so long with your adrenals, like running on empty, like our body adapts, right? And I think this is why people can also go so long with so many things going wrong in our body. I mean, your body's going to adapt to the stress, but there is a breaking point. I also think there's a breaking point. And it's going to, a lot of times it's, it's when people wait too long to do something about it. And then you get to the point where it's like, well, now everything's broken. But yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you. I think the body adapts, and that's why we can go so long with running our bodies into the ground before our bodies give out. But by that time, now you have like 28 problems and not just one or two.
Yeah. And my terminology for somebody when they come in, they say, do I have an adrenal problem? Do I have a thyroid problem? Do I have a gut issue? Do I have this? I say, listen, you have a multi-system adaptive disorder.
Yes. I like that. I like that term. Yeah.
Because I think all the tissues are adapting. And the analogy I usually use is if somebody broke into your home and started attacking one of your kids, are you going to continue to cook and clean and do all those things? You're probably not. And if I walked in and saw the food's burning on the stove and the house is a mess, I can make the assumption that you're a terrible cook and mom and housewife, right? Or caretaker or homemaker. Or I can say, this seems abnormal here. What's going on? Maybe I need to investigate this. And I think I think in functional medicine, that's what we really should be doing, right? So it's not unusual. So I agree. And I think it's probably part of your FDN training. I think I've interviewed, I think your founder on the podcast before. And that's one of the things I liked him. I think he comes from that cell danger response physiology or thought process or hypothesis, which is, to me, foundational. We have to think from, is this a person in homeostasis or allostasis?
Right.
If they're having dysfunction, we have to assume if they're in allostasis, we shouldn't expect that they're going to respond to the things that we want to do for them the same they would if they were in homeostasis.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
So where do you see the connection, or how do you, when somebody comes into you and they have their chronic tiredness, fatigue, and you're thinking, man, what's going on here? What are you doing from an assessment point to find out, do I have a thyroid issue? Do I have an adrenal issue? Do I have something else going on? And how do I address it?
Well, so I'm running functional labs on people, and I have a few like kind of foundational labs I run on everybody. And then depending on the person, we could add a few more things in. But the Dutch test is one that I love. We look at, cortisol pattern and cortisol levels and cortisol metabolism and all that to see how your adrenals are working. And then I also, the HTMA, the hair tissue mineral analysis, is another one of my foundational labs, because it's telling me a lot more than just what's going on with your adrenals and with your thyroid. But those are two of the big pieces I can put together with what we see on the Dutch test, because the Dutch gives such a comprehensive look at what's going on with your adrenals. So first step is always going to be the functional labs and looking at, okay, what is the data showing us? Where can we, connect dots and start to find patterns and what's going on with the adrenals, the thyroid?
So in your training or as you're assessing somebody, kind of the foundational things, if somebody's, let me say it this way. There's thought processes in functional medicine about where to start, what to do, how to treat, and we're going to make generalisms because everybody's different and unique. But there's a discussion about thyroid physiology and adrenal physiology, and there's kind of two camps. One that says you have to fix thyroid physiology before the adrenals are going to work. The other is that you have to address the adrenals and fix the adrenals before the thyroid physiology is going to work. What's your thoughts on those two ideas and concepts?
I see. So you mean more of like the order of operations here, the order that we're addressing things in. So my take is I don't necessarily start with one or the other. I start with the minerals. The minerals is always where I start. I'm not addressing the hormones. I'm not addressing your estrogen levels. I'm not addressing any of that until I address the minerals. When I'm addressing the minerals, I feel that I'm really addressing kind of both at the same time. Now, granted, I will say I do take more precautions for the adrenals and the thyroid starting out because we're doing some other things. We're working with like nervous system regulation and stress management, all those things to kind of calm down the adrenals. We're getting rid of caffeine and all the things that are like stimulating adrenals. So I will say I probably take a few more precautions from that perspective, but from a mineral balancing perspective, it's all of it at the same time because I feel that I need to work on balancing out the minerals and start getting those pieces balanced out before I can start addressing, the dysbiosis in the gut or whatever we see in the gut and the hormones, the estrogen levels or, whatever else I'm looking at.
Okay. So let's start with this because somebody's listening to this and going, I don't even know what she's talking about.
Yes.
What are the minerals, right? And what are the minerals that you're looking at to assess to determine if they're in balance? Yeah.
So I mentioned before, I use a hair tissue mineral analysis, and it's basically measuring like a couple dozen different minerals in the body. It's looking at the big four, right? It's calcium, magnesium, sodium, potassium. Then it's looking at a handful of other minerals. It's looking at other toxic elements. It's looking at heavy metals. And then it's also looking at the relationships between the minerals. And I think this is where it's really important to have a trained practitioner look at a lab like this, because you could look at an HTMA and you could look at like the individual mineral levels and you can interpret it like 20 different ways. But when you're able to look at the relationships between them is when we start to see what's going wrong. So we can look at like sodium to magnesium, for example, and see really what your adrenals are doing. And, based on if the ratio is high or low, then I know that your adrenals are running really sluggishly or they're running way too fast. We can do the same thing looking at what your thyroid is doing. And so when I'm looking specifically, talking about adrenals and the thyroid. Potassium is a big one for the thyroid. So I'm looking at potassium levels. Sodium, magnesium, I'm looking at for your adrenals. And then also looking at calcium and phosphorus and kind of comparing those two things as well, looking at your thyroid. So those are probably the main ones I'm looking at. The sodium, magnesium are kind of the first places we address. The sodium, I could talk all day about sodium.
Well, let's hold on for a sec. So some people are thinking, why are you looking at somebody's hair? Why wouldn't you look at somebody's blood?
Good question. Yes.
Right.
Good question.
Because blood's the standard. So
yes, blood is the standard. Right. So here's the thing with blood, and you can tell me what your opinion is on this, but I think with any lab, especially with the mineral testing, but I think with any blood lab, blood is just, right. You're just looking at a blip in time, right, of what's going on in the body. And when you're doing any blood lab, in my opinion, and when you're doing minerals, you can go get a panel done at the doctor, but it's just like an acute picture of what's going on, right? It's not a look at what's going on chronically in the body. And not only that, but a lot of the minerals in our bodies that are important to look at are intracellular, meaning they're in your cells. So for measuring the blood, it's really not that accurate. Like you're really not getting an accurate picture of what's going on. So when you're doing the HTMA, you're literally sitting on some of your hair, and here's a tissue. So you're looking at what's being pushed out into your tissue. So you're literally looking at what's going on at a cellular level with these mineral levels.
But how do we know that what we see in the hair test is not, if we see high levels in there, or low levels in there, how do we know that that's really what's happening in the cellular system and that we have optimal physiology? Because there's arguments that you could make arguments both ways, right?
Sure.
And
for sure.
I primarily do blood assessment, right? I don't think necessarily, I agree with you that the status in the blood does not always correlate. And for the listener, like let's say B12, right? So you could say, hey, B12, my B12 is good because the B12 in my bloodstream is good. Well, that doesn't tell us what's going on inside the cell. Right. So we might look at other indicators of B12 status. Now, your MD might just run B12 because they want to know what B12 is. But what's in the bloodstream doesn't always correlate with what's happening in the cell. And we could look at homocysteine to see, hey, how am I doing? Am I converting that, getting that B12 into the cell? And am I using it to help with either glutathione production or recycling of homocysteine? That could be an impact of B9 physiology, B6 physiology, right? So, but we could look at homocysteine. We could look at methylmalonic acid, which gives us an indication of how much B12 is getting to the mitochondria, right? So we can have a discussion there. We can look at somebody's red blood cells and look at the differential of their blood cells, MCV, MCH, these criteria of the size of the red blood cells, and say, oh, that gives me some indication of B12 status. So what's in the blood doesn't always correlate with what's inside the cell. So that's important. But there's, and you can have from your perspective, pros and cons with blood work, right? And there's pros and cons with hair tissue mineral analysis. So I think one of those things to consider is how do we, when we're thinking about it, is how do we know what we see in the hair mineral analysis is the reflection of what's going on inside the body, just like when we run an organic acid, and I teach on organic acids, but the problem is what I see in the urine truly a reflection of what's going on in the cell. A lot of that, some of the science says some of these things are accurate, some are not. So I just want to get your opinion. Okay?
No, I mean, I agree with you. And I think it's true for any lab, right? I mean, I think it's true for any lab. And I think that's why I think a crucial part of functional medicine and functional nutrition is not just looking at the lab. Like you have to look at the person too, and you have to correlate the symptoms. So sometimes, and it's true too, when you're looking at the HTMA, sometimes things can leave you with more questions than answers, and you have to do deeper investigation. Like, okay, I'm looking at, elevated copper levels. Well, that can mean multiple things, right? It could mean that you do have too much copper, or it could mean that it's super bio unavailable and it's being pushed onto your tissues and your body's not using it. So you really have to connect with the human, the person, and not just look at the labs.
Yeah. And that's kind of the answer I was looking for from you. It's like, okay, what we need to do oftentimes is not look at one test and make a definitive response. We need to look at things, and given, let's say, the copper explanation, like, hey, I've got high copper on my hair mineral analysis, right? What does that mean? We could then go to their iron panel and say, oh, I've got high copper on my hair tissue mineral analysis, and my serum iron and my iron saturation is elevated. I might have high copper because I'm excreting it, right? And so therefore it's not in the system to be able to be used, right? Or we could say, look at it from the other perspective. Maybe I've got excessive copper consumption and intake, and that's why it's high on there.
And that's when you have to know your client, because if my client's been on a copper IUD for 10 years, then I mean, of course that's why their copper is elevated,
So that's the piece that I was trying to kind of ink out of you, is because we may not all agree on the exact testing, right? But one of those things that becomes really important is, are we just going with a test? I think anybody can read a test, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And organic acids, like I talked to somebody the other day and they're like, hey, I did an organic acid. I ordered all the stuff that they gave me the recommendations for, and I don't feel better. I'm like, because
it's one test, right? It's one test, and it's not,
and it's not just micronutrient deficiencies. We have to ask why those things aren't. So it's what should be different about functional medicine, in my opinion, is being able to take a test that you have a strong belief in the validity of it, and correlate it with signs, symptoms, and other labs to be able to say, hey, this makes sense for what I see on here versus just reading for high or low, which is, I think, the piece that you were starting to talk about. Hey, we've got to interpret labs, which I don't think we oftentimes do a very good job of. We just read them for high or low.
Right. Well, and I think too, I also think this is kind of a piece that like the allopathic method kind of lists out, because a lot of times the doctors are just looking at the labs and they're not looking at the person. And so then there's a huge piece that's missing there, is they're only looking at the lab. And why are the labs looking at this? Like, should I ask about diet and lifestyle and all these other things? So I mean, I just think you can't, there's no way to have, like, to really get to the root cause of anything without doing both. Like you have to have both. You have to be able to look at both.
I totally agree. Right. So, and the issue comes down to the broader the picture we're looking at, the clearer it becomes.
Yeah.
Right. The narrower we make it. So we could say, hey, what, the doctor only runs a TSH in free T4. So how can they see the other part? Well, if I'm that medical physician, my job is only to determine when the thyroid gland's bad enough that I need to give T4. So I don't need to look at the other things. Right. Whereas somebody else might say, well, I want to look at a broader picture. The reason you don't feel good is because you're not converting that T4 to T3. And that's a big piece of the puzzle. But for the clinician who's been taught that, hey, this is all I need to look at, narrow the picture makes it real easy, right? Hey, these are only two things I got to worry about. But in functional medicine, we're looking at a bigger picture. So I want to get back to the hair mineral analysis then. And you said there was some key ratios that you like to take a look at. So what are the key ratios that you look at on there that might give you some indication that I have some problems potentially with adrenal function and adrenal physiology?
So when we're looking specifically at adrenals, we're looking at the sodium to magnesium ratio, and that's what we want to look at. So your adrenals really use most of the sodium in your body. And when your adrenals are constantly chugging out cortisol and they're just, pumping till they're death, you're just depleting your sodium stores. And really the same thing with your magnesium. I think magnesium, it's used for so many different functions in the body. It's just I think that's why it's so easily depleted, why so many of us are deficient. So we're looking at, for adrenals, we're looking at the sodium to magnesium ratio. So with a high ratio, a high sodium to magnesium ratio, we're looking at excessive adrenal activity, like they're just working too quickly. And then we see a lower ratio, then that means the adrenals are running more sluggishly.
So low sodium to magnesium, you have more of a hypoadrenal function, and a high sodium to magnesium ratio. And it sounds like you don't run maybe a lot of blood labs. But if you do you see a similar ratio in blood, or is it only you see it in the hair?
I find that it's not as easy to tell in blood, and I think it's mainly because of the magnesium. Like 99% of our magnesium is in our cells, and I don't think the blood lab really gives the whole picture of the magnesium. So I find that it doesn't always correlate with the blood. I'm not saying it can't ever, but I just find that it's not always as it doesn't always say the same thing as the hair analysis. Yeah.
And so you look at sodium magnesium ratio. What else do you look at?
So for the thyroid, we would look at the calcium to potassium ratio. And so, potassium is associated with the sensitivity of tissue to the thyroid hormone, which is, in my case, I don't know about your experience. In my experience, every client I've ever had come to me with thyroid-ish, whatever, is their potassium levels are low. So we're looking at the calcium to potassium ratio. So a higher ratio means a more sluggish thyroid. The thyroid is running slower. A lower ratio, lower calcium to potassium ratio would mean that more more excessive thyroid action.
So say that again. So if it's a high ratio,
then it's more hypo, right? It's more sluggish thyroid. Looking at sluggish thyroid if it's a high ratio.
Okay.
Which means our potassium, levels are pretty depleted.
Okay.
And then if it's a low ratio, then it would be more hyper.
Okay. And again, this is looking at hair, right? And not looking at blood.
Right.
Right.
Correct. Yep.
Okay. Yep. And so sodium, magnesium, you look at adrenal, it's calcium, potassium, you're looking at, you're considering what's going on with the thyroid at the thyroid gland, are you saying, or are you talking about thyroid physiology in general?
It's just physiology in general. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So What else are you looking at from a mineral standpoint?
Yeah, so we're looking at sodium. So sodium to potassium is another ratio we look at, and it's considered like the vitality ratio, and it's linked to kind of like stress and inflammation in the body, overall stress and inflammation in the body. So when you have a high sodium to potassium ratio, basically we're looking at like pretty significant inflammation in the body, right? There could be, some hidden copper toxicity we need to look for. It's sometimes a good indication of there's an estrogen dominance going on, like stress on the liver, because stress raises sodium. And so that's where our ratio is going to be off. And then if it's a low sodium to potassium ratio, you're more susceptible to things like chronic infections, like anemia. Sometimes there's like trauma. I find that there's like a link to like trauma involved. There was some traumatic something that happened that kind of depleted both of these. So sodium potassium is more for like overall vitality. And then if we want to look at zinc to copper ratio is another one to look at. And this is one which we mentioned copper before. This is one that is a good indication that there is a potential copper toxicity, which is a bunch of other boxes to check for that. So it's not, you can't look at that and explicitly be like, oh, that means you have a copper toxicity. But a lot of times this also tells what our hormones just in general are doing. And so a high ratio typically means that, or a low ratio typically means that there could be an estrogen dominance. And so I want to kind of connect the dots there with looking at estrogen levels too.
So what's the high ratio on a hair mineral analysis indicate?
For a zinc to copper ratio,
Mm-hmm.
This basically typically means either A, you have either copper deficiency or copper toxicity. Again, it's all about like correlating to the person, right? So that it could mean one end of the other of the spectrum on that. And it could also be that someone is a super fast oxidizer, meaning like they're breaking things down too quickly, and we might need to like support their oxidation level, because that's another thing that the hair tissue mineral analysis looks at. Yeah. And then if it is somebody that is a slow oxidizer, it could mean that we need to support zinc, that the zinc stores are just too low, and that this could lead to like immune dysfunction, that kind of thing.
Okay. So you're doing your hair tissue mineral analysis, and you're saying, hey, I've got high levels, low levels, and maybe I have ratio issues.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're doing what?
So then we're addressing that. So if there's heavy metal toxicity, copper is probably the one I see the most. Mercury is an issue. Let's see, I would probably say mercury, aluminum, and copper, probably the biggest heavy metals that we have to deal with. If there's a copper toxicity, we want to work on that. But a lot of times it's kind of like you were saying, where the body is kind of in this adaptive state. Mm-hmm. We have to support kind of overall function in the body first. Like, we're not just going to get rid and like have your body dump all these heavy metals right away. Like, we have to kind of prepare the body for that. So we want to support like basic mineral levels first. So I work directly with the lab that basically you can customize the mineral protocol to the HTMA. So we kind of work on what's low, what needs to be balanced, what needs to be shifted here, what needs to be shifted there. And I can build just a basic supplement protocol for them to work on just like basic mineral levels. So supporting basic mineral levels is going to be first and foremost. And then at the same time, helping with, liver function, so that, we have proper bioflow, our liver's functioning well enough so that when we do get to the point, if we need to get rid of heavy metals, if there's a toxicity there, that we have ideal bioflow, our liver's working, as optimally as possible so that our body can get rid of things.
So let me back you up. So if you find that somebody's got you said, hey, I'm looking at this hair tissue mineral analysis, and I'm going to try and balance their minerals first, right?
Right.
So if you've got, somebody's got low, let's say they have low sodium and low magnesium, right? But the ratio is off. Are you providing them with more magnesium and you're providing them with more sodium?
Right.
And then if they're both low, how are we making the determine, or you're just saying, hey, it's low, but are we trying to assess why it's low? Are we assessing, hey, I got a renal issue that I'm not recycling sodium appropriately, so I'm losing it? And does increased excretion through the renal system correlate with increased excretion in the hair, or does low adrenal or does increased renal excretion correlate with high levels in the hair? How do we correlate what we see in urine with what's going on in the hair? Is it the opposite? Is it the same?
So if you're, I feel like you said it the right way the first time. So if you're, well, first of all, typically, first we're going to adjust adrenal, like, period. Like if the ratio is up, we're going to adjust, like, we're not only addressing the sodium and the magnesium levels. Like, there's reasons that your adrenals, right, are running. Typically it's too slow. I would say the majority of the time it's a sluggish adrenal situation. And so addressing the adrenals just in general first, not even seeing it as like a renal issue, but like your adrenals are super tired right now. Like, they're running in a totally like exhaustive state right now. So first it's addressing it. So kind of like I was mentioning before, getting rid of things that are like stimulating the adrenals. So let's calm down what's going on in the body. Let's support like overall stress management, nervous system regulation. So let's start doing just, the lifestyle things. Like, let's kind of implement some of those things as well. And then we're going to address the sodium and the magnesium level. So I guess to answer your question, when I'm looking explicitly at an adrenal situation, when your adrenals are like so tired and exhausted, I haven't even looked at like what's going on with the kidneys at this point. It's like, let's just calm down your adrenals and calm down, like, support the adrenals overall before we start doing anything else.
Okay. So you're looking at your patient's health history, you're doing this. Are you typically running this hair tissue and mineral analysis along with your Dutch test at the same time? Yeah,
all the other labs. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, I've done all the other labs too.
When you're looking at so what you're saying is, when you look at a sodium magnesium ratio, and you're seeing that the pattern is, it's a lower ratio.
Right.
You're saying, hey, I've got an adrenal gland that's hypoactive, right? Then you're seeing what on a Dutch test that's correlating that?
So the Dutch test is going to give you a really good indication of what your overall cortisol pattern is, and it's going to show cortisone and cortisol output, right? Like the 24-hour output of cortisone and cortisol and how it's being metabolized. So looking at that to see, am I preferring cortisone or cortisol? Like, am I clearing cortisol too quickly? Am I not converting it right? So that's the other piece too. We can see, is it a conversion issue? Or now we need to address, like, okay, we need to support the liver because there's like a conversion thing going on. Is it a DHEA issue where it starts at the top? So we can kind of correlate that too to see if they're like liver function that's also contributing to the fact that your adrenals aren't running properly because things aren't being converted right, or they're being cleared too fast. Maybe we can slow down how quickly you're clearing out the cortisol, that kind of thing.
Okay. So I guess what I'm trying to find out, like, if you're looking at your hair tissue mineral analysis and we're saying, hey, this sodium to magnesium ratio is low, and I've just done my Dutch test, and I'm going to, so somebody's got their Dutch test done, right? And they want to know, do I have a pattern of low adrenal physiology? Because which is what you're saying, right? Based on the ratio,
right? What
should they be looking for on a Dutch test?
Okay, I see
that's telling them that they actually have low adrenal output.
So for the most part, what I'm seeing is, first of all, the overall pattern is low. It's well below. So if you look at the pattern, your cortisol pattern, right, the ideal pattern, it's going to be running super low. And typically they're running pretty low levels of cortisone and cortisol. Like, I'm seeing usually both are pretty low, like just low output altogether, cortisone and cortisol. So they got low cortisone and then it's being converted into low cortisol. So just overall, I'm just seeing low levels of cortisol, cortisol. And then the pattern is just staying pretty low. A lot of times I have either if it's a super low pattern, or it's like a totally whacked out pattern. Like it's like starting high in the morning and then it just crashes sometime at the middle of the day. And it's just like non-existent by the end of the day. So their cortisol pattern is just kind of wacky.
Okay. So you're talking about free cortisol and cortisone pattern. So for the listener, if you get a Dutch test, There's two different types of a Dutch test. One is looking at salivary cortisol, which is the free cortisol that's hitting the tissue. And there's cortisol and cortisone. Cortisol is the activated form. Cortisone is the deactivated form, or the circulating storage form, we should say. And so you can get a rhythm of how much cortisol is hitting the tissues based on what the saliva pattern looks like. There's also, if you get just a standard Dutch test, they have urine metabolites on that same graph. And you're looking at how much of the urine, how much cortisol is showing up in the urine. And then we're making an assumption like, hey, this is all what's showing up in the urine. So if you have a Dutch test that is looking at the urine pattern, right? Then you can look at the metabolized cortisol, and you can look at the individual pattern and say, hey, I have less metabolized cortisol in the system, and that might correlate with reduced cortisol production. It could. Right?
Could, yes, could, yes.
If you get the salivary one, that's called the Dutch Plus test, then you're taking that graph that she's talking about, the circadian rhythm, is actually measuring the amount of free cortisol and cortisone that's actually hitting the tissues. But that doesn't really tell us total production necessarily. We have to then take a look at the metabolized cortisol to potentially get an idea of, do I have reduced output? And what you were saying, what Hope was saying about the pattern or the curve, right? The circadian rhythm, if it's flat, really low, and the metabolized cortisol is also very low, that's a pretty good indication that maybe there's reduced adrenal function. And so then I'm guessing, and I'm going to let you jump in there in a second, that when you look at this sodium to magnesium on your hair mineral analysis, and you see, if you're looking at the one with the saliva and the urine is both of those, then you might be looking for, do I have a flat line with my saliva values and a low metabolized, right? Or do I have a normal pattern and low metabolized? So that's what I'm trying to get to. Like, so if somebody's listening to us talking about this and you're saying, hey, I've got a sodium magnesium, and then, which is, hey, that's what you see, you run that test, but you're also running the Dutch test. Somebody may look at their Dutch test and say, well, I've got a lot of metabolized cortisol, right? And I have, or, you know, how am I correlating those two things? That's what I'm trying to maybe not do a good job of. How are you correlating? What do you see when you see that pattern on the hair tissue mineral analysis and you're looking at your Dutch? What are you doing to look on the Dutch test to confirm that, yes, I have a hypoadrenal pattern, right?
Yeah. I mean, I may be repeating myself, but yeah, I mean, typically I'm looking at, basically I'll be seeing low levels just overall, low output overall. I just do the urine one. I don't do the saliva one. I used to do the saliva one, but I just like the urine one because it gives all the organic acids and stuff. But I do the urine one. And so typically I'm just looking at low output overall on the Dutch test. Low output, I'm seeing a low pattern. I'm usually seeing like a totally flat line, at least by the end of the day, if not for most of the day, just low function overall, low pattern overall.
Okay. And if you saw a low sodium magnesium pattern on your hair mineral analysis, and then you go and you look at your Dutch test and the urine metabolites aren't low, then what are we thinking? Because it doesn't always correlate.
You're right. Yeah, there's got to be deeper investigation. Yeah, there's got to be deeper investigation. And I think a lot of times too, it's sometimes too, so kind of like we're talking about the copper could be like high copper could be two different things. The same thing with magnesium. So sometimes the ratios don't correlate because sometimes the magnesium on an HTMA is elevated, and it doesn't mean that your magnesium is too high, but it means that it's bio-unavailable, kind of like the copper situation. So sometimes and again, it requires deeper investigation. It requires you looking at the symptomology of the person. We kind of have to dig deeper because the ratio may not match up, and it could be a situation where is magnesium high, or is it being pushed out, and that's why it's high in the lab. So we do have to kind of dive in there, and it's usually being able to kind of connect those, because I the Dutch test for me is going to be more like straightforward, I guess, with like showing with, you know, the pattern and the metabolized cortisol. The HTMA is where we kind of have to look at like, okay, well, let's look at what's going on the Dutch test. And then I can kind of figure out the ratios here. And my ratio is this way because, well, my magnesium is too high to what. So I feel like in that instance, I would look more at the Dutch test and then match that with the person, what's going on with the person and the person's body. And then we can kind of figure out, kind of read between the lines on the HTMA.
Okay. So when you're looking at trying to kind of balance out those minerals, and you see that sodium this ratio is low, right? Mm-hmm. Sodium is low, magnesium's higher, right? So that's why the ratio is lower. Mm-hmm. How are you balancing those? What's your thought process and how you're balancing them? Because are you thinking I need to give more magnesium and sodium? Are you thinking I need to give them in different concentrations? Or if sodium is really high, how do you actually go about balancing those?
Yeah. So with the lab that I use, and I'll give them the shout out, Vicon is the lab. If you want to use Vicon labs, they kind of help. And this is why they're so great, because they have different formulations that you can customize, but they have them based on whether someone is a slow oxidizer or a fast oxidizer as well. So I can use that with kind of formulating what they're using and with their mineral protocol. And for the most part, I'm doing both. It's going to be more magnesium than it is sodium, but it is going to be both. But typically the magnesium, it's going to be a lot more concentrated with the magnesium than the sodium. But either way, the sea salt is going to be added to the formulation to balance both of them out.
So are you seeing in general, if you have a hypothyroid pattern, you're seeing a lower sodium relative to magnesium on a hair tissue mineral analysis, but are you thinking, because you're giving stuff, so is the issue more of a sodium deficiency? Is the issue more of a magnesium excess, or is the issue I have sodium excess and magnesium, because they're excreting? How do we get there?
For the most part, and this is just what I typically see in my experience, for the most part, it's a sodium deficiency. I have yet to have a client doing
sodium deficiency in the body.
Yes.
Okay.
Correct.
And they have enough magnesium in the body, but a sodium deficiency in the body.
Correct. Okay. And not necessarily that they have enough, but typically it's more of a sodium imbalance than it is a magnesium imbalance.
And what triggers the low sodium or the sodium balance?
It's the adrenals working in overdrive. The adrenals are just pumping out. The adrenals use so much sodium, and vitamin C are what the adrenals use most of. And when our body is chronically stressed, when our adrenals are working in overdrive and they're constantly pumping out cortisol, it's constantly pumping through your sodium supplies. And so a chronically stressed body is going to run through sodium supplies pretty quick. And so I find the majority of my clients are sodium deficient for that reason.
Do you think that has to do with when you're talking about the adrenal gland and you're talking about cortisol, do you think that has maybe more to do with aldosterone production than it does with the cortisol?
I think that's a good point. I mean, I think, I totally think that could play a part in it. And I think that's, I think probably yes to answer that question. I think, yeah.
Okay. So for the listeners, aldosterone is another hormone that's made by the adrenal gland. And so aldosterone should be there to help recycle that sodium back into the system.
Right.
And when there's potential challenges with the adrenal gland, you can have less aldosterone production. And you're going to wind up not recycling as much of the sodium, and you're going to pee that stuff out of the system. Right. And so your sodium levels could be lower, which in blood work, we could also see the same thing with the low sodium to potassium ratio. In the hair mineral analysis, what Hope is saying is that the sodium might also be lower in the hair, and the magnesium relatively being higher, and that might look like a hypoadrenal pattern. Okay. And so the other thing we might see when we have a hypoadrenal pattern is, hey, maybe the cortisol output is downregulated as
Right.
well.
Right.
If it's a true downregulation of the adrenal gland, and you're looking at your Dutch test, is there anything else on that Dutch test that might clue you in that say, hey, I've got some reduced adrenal function? Because everybody talks about adrenal fatigue. So
Yeah.
is it adrenal fatigue? And I don't know that the adrenal gland fatigues. I'd argue that
Right.
point. But what else is on that Dutch test? So if somebody's looking at that Dutch test, that they've got their hair, hey, that sodium potassium piece, I got that. I've got maybe lower urinary metabolized cortisol. What else is on that Dutch test might clue somebody in to the fact that my adrenals aren't working so great?
Yeah, I think, and you might disagree with this, but I find that most of the time too. So on the Dutch test, I do the Dutch complete with the organic acids. I find that most of the time the B vitamins are pretty low as well. I find that typically correlates. I'd say most of the time that correlates too with just overall, and it may not be directly related to the adrenals, and maybe just overall like reduced function in the body. But I just find that that's another one that I typically find when I'm looking at the Dutch test is the B vitamins are deficient.
Okay. And so the other thing that I would consider if I was looking at that Dutch test is I take a look at the DHEA as well.
Yeah, for sure.
Right? Because if it's reduced activation of the adrenal gland, right? And most of the DHEA is being made by that adrenal gland. If cortisol is low and DHEA is low, then probably a good indication, along with this sodium, magnesium, and sodium, potassium, we start to say, hey, I've got reduced adrenal output for some reason. Right. And then then we have to start to take a look at the reasons as to potentially why.
Right.
One of those things that you talked about is, hey, we've got to support the adrenal gland. To try and reduce some of the stress. So it's not overtaxed or overworked. Right. So what are some of the strategies that you might kind of use with somebody who potentially looks like they have lower adrenal output? What are the strategies that you might start to use for somebody? Because I think I heard you say, and I just want to make sure I'm not saying this wrong, that you got to support the adrenal physiology pretty early on here. Yeah. So what are we doing to try and support that adrenal physiology?
So sodium, magnesium are going to be two important things for that. I think the other piece, chromium is another important mineral. So just speaking just minerals first. Sodium, magnesium, and chromium, I think, are really important there. Vitamin C is another thing that just gets depleted as a part of the body's stress response. It's secreted out as a part of the body's stress response. And so vitamin C is another one that we could add to that. It's not really mineral, it's a vitamin, but it can also add it to that. Chromium is used, it's necessary for insulin regulation. So it works along with the adrenals for the production of insulin. So I think managing blood sugar levels just in general, along with the chromium, is going to be important for overall adrenal function. And then, the non-sexy stuff that we don't really talk about enough, I think, is the lifestyle stuff. I think, people don't want to know that they should go for a walk or meditate or do mindfulness or whatever, but just managing stress is such a huge piece of it. And being able to kind of figure out what that is. And for a lot of my clients, I work with it's mostly women. I work with some men and some kids too, but it's mostly women, and they're all really high performing women. And asking them to slow down is a big ask. So usually there's a lot involved in just that piece. Like what steps can we take to manage your stress? Like we need to calm your body down. So that's a big piece of it too. So it's managing the minerals, it's managing the vitamins and minerals, but it's also, how it got there in the first place. Your body's overstressed. So let's figure out how we can mitigate that.
And I think the lifestyle things are key, right? We talk about proper breathing so you're not creating stress. We talk about proper sleep habits so we're not having a lot of excessive stress response. We talk about blood sugar regulation, but more importantly, what we put into the system. We talk about, there's some of the things you mentioned, but how about, do you consider adaptogens to help support?
I do. I do like adaptogens.
And can you explain what an adaptogen is and how it impacts the adrenal physiology?
Yeah, so adaptogens are herbs that basically helps your body's response to stress. So, you've probably heard of ashwagandha. It's a really trendy one right now. Like ashwagandha is a big one, rhodiola is a big one, but adaptogenic herbs for sure. And I typically, I don't usually add those right away. I kind of work on the mineral part, the lifestyle part, kind of let things balance out, and then I add the adaptogens. But I do think adaptogens can be really supportive for overall function. Yeah, for sure.
Okay. And then what role, when you talk about this, hey, I've got this hypoadrenal function, what other things maybe might you start to consider versus the adrenal? I mean, we throw the term out, adrenal fatigue, but what are other factors that are causing the cortisol production or the DHEA production to be downregulated? What other things go through your mind that might be influencing the amount of cortisol or DHEA that's being produced?
Well, a big thing that I'm looking at is, which was another reason why I like the Dutch test, is also what the liver's doing. Like in looking at, because the liver is responsible for conversion and clearance of things, right? And so that's the other piece I'm looking at is, how's the liver functioning overall? And is clearance or conversion an issue? Because that's also going to affect like kind of what your cortisol is doing in the body.
Okay. So where do you see the tie to cortisol levels with your thyroid hormone? Where do you see thyroid hormone playing a role in that low
Connecting with the
function?
adrenals? Yeah. So the thyroid and the adrenals really work together, right? So the thyroid kind of takes some of its orders from the adrenals, and I think it's kind of where the adrenals are kind of like the gas, and then the thyroid's running the engine. It's kind of one of those things. That's how I see it. And so if the thyroid is taking its cues from the adrenals, then if your oil and gas are running low chronically because your adrenals are chronically stressed, then it's going to slow down the engine. It's going to slow down the thyroid. And so they have to be able to talk to each other and send the right signals. And when one's slowing down, the other one's going to slow down.
Well, I think, yeah, they are, but let me add a little extra to that. Okay. So one of the things that we need to consider is, how is cortisol generated, right? So how do we make cortisol? What's the starting piece for cortisol? The starting piece for cortisol is cholesterol. Okay. And so where does the cholesterol come from? So cholesterol in a homeostatic state or in a chronic stress state, most of the cholesterol that's used to make cortisol and the adrenal hormones is coming from the bloodstream. Okay. So how does that cortisol get into the adrenal gland? It requires T3 to support the docking station to bring it into the system. So if there's a lower T3 state in the physiology, then I'm going to bring less cortisol, or I'm going to bring less cholesterol into the adrenal gland, and I'm going to make less cortisol, and I'm probably going to make less of the other hormones. Now, that isn't always true, because in acute states, the adrenal gland can make its own cholesterol, and then it can convert that into cortisol. And that makes a lot of sense for, hey, if I'm in acute stress, I need to increase the cortisol production, which is why sometimes when we look at an adrenal test, we say this is a person who has signs and symptoms of tiredness and fatigue and what we might call adrenal fatigue syndrome. And yet we look at their panel and they don't have low cortisol.
Right.
Okay. Because maybe they're in more acute stress when this test is getting done.
Right.
T3 plays another role in the production of cortisol, and that is you need to bring that cortisol into the mitochondria, convert it into pregnenolone, and then it can be generated into the hormones like cortisol and progesterone. And to run mitochondrial function, you need optimal levels of T3. So if somebody has a low levels of T3 in the bloodstream, in the tissue, you're going to have oftentimes higher cholesterol building up in the bloodstream, And so when we look at low adrenal function and we're thinking, hey, I have somebody with hypoadrenal function, you're looking at sodium, magnesium level on your hair tissue mineral analysis. Then you're getting to your Dutch test and you're saying, hey, I've got some low cortisol on here, and I've got some maybe a low cortisol rhythm on here. Maybe I've got low production overall. Maybe my adrenal gland's not being stimulated. Maybe I'm not making enough, or maybe I just don't have the resources because I have low T3. I can't make sufficient amounts of adrenal hormones. And one of the things we can then do is go look at maybe something like your cholesterol level and say, hey, the reason maybe I have low adrenal function or low cortisol is because I have low T3. I've got high cholesterol in the bloodstream. I can't get that into the adrenal gland to make into those things. So therefore, I've got low levels. And in that situation, what do we do? Right? But that's one way to take a look at it. The other thing we could take a look at, and this is where sometimes the confusion is, when we look at blood levels of cortisol, especially like a morning cortisol level in the blood, the morning cortisol levels are normal in somebody who we think has adrenal fatigue. Right. And they're oftentimes normal when we're looking at a Dutch test and we see, hey, my Dutch test shows a lower cortisol metabolites. My blood levels show a normal level of cortisol. How do you rectify that? Now, you may say, I don't know, if you're not looking at blood cortisol, you may not see it, but if somebody had normal blood cortisol, low levels on a Dutch, you've got your sodium, magnesium levels. How are you helping the patient understand what the heck is going on? Because their primary care physician, if you're saying, hey, you've got low adrenal function, and their primary care says, well, let me take a look at your blood cortisol level and it's normal, how do you rectify that with your client?
Yeah.
How would you do it?
I think it goes back to what we were saying before with we're running multiple labs. We're not just looking at one. We're looking at the person and we're looking at their symptomology and we're putting all the pieces together. So I'm not just gonna, protocol just looking at one lab. I'm not going to recommend a protocol just looking at just the labs, right? I feel like that all of the pieces have to be put together to be able to give an accurate, recommendation for a protocol. I just think all the pieces have to be put together.
Yeah. Well, I think sometimes, that's the big challenge, right? Is we run a functional test and then you have a patient who gets their blood work done and we're telling them, hey, this value says we've got low adrenal function. We get another test that says, no, you have plenty of cortisol in your bloodstream.
Right.
And we've got to be able to make, we got to help that patient understand. We just spent a couple $100 on a hormone panel.
More than that, but yeah.
and now we've got a blood value that says it's different. And maybe you don't come in contact with it, but I think that's an important thing for the client to understand is when we look at different tests, we have to be able to interpret these things and pull all those pieces together, because you could get a different interpretation of what's going on if you just ran a blood test, right? You can get, if you just run a Dutch test, you can get a different interpretation of what's going on. You may run a Dutch and a blood at the same time, which I often do. And sometimes they correlate really well. And sometimes they don't. And the challenge becomes, how do you interpret it? And somebody who's not maybe really well versed in interpreting those may be lost in, hey, I don't know what to do with these values. But when you have somebody who's pretty good at interpreting these things, they can say, okay, let me explain to you why it's low on urine, but high in blood. Let me explain to you why it's high in your urine and normal in blood. So we have to be able to explain those things, because many times, as you said, the blood value is a steady state. The body often fights to maintain a steady state. And I think a morning cortisol is one of those examples that, hey, having an appropriate cortisol awakening response and seeing that rise in cortisol in the morning, I think the body's kind of keyed into being able to try and manage that. It's why we typically don't see it drop too low unless somebody's got like an Addison's condition going on. But these are tests. So it's important that you realize that when you're getting a test done, you can get different interpretations based on what somebody's running, but the best thing to do is kind of put those pieces together.
Right.
And we got to be careful that we're not jumping sometimes to the wrong conclusions based on a limited view of things.
Right.
So let's get back to minerals and adrenal function. So we talked about the adrenals. We talked about your process. So you're looking at a bunch of these things. So from a mineral standpoint, when you do the hair mineral analysis, you're looking at the hair mineral analysis, you're getting a formulation made that's kind of unique to the patient's test results, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're getting them that mineral support product. And then where are we going from here? Like, what do we do? Are you starting, when you see low values, do you start to, are the low values because of the adrenal issues, or is the low values due to malabsorption issues or something else? And where do you go from there?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And again, I think it goes back to like connecting dots and things. I think I do like the organic acids test. I just started running that one not too long ago on most of my clients. I wasn't running it very much, and then I started using it more often. But I think that's another good one that can kind of give picture of, it can give some other clues to absorption and things. But I think if, when I'm doing the protocol, and I kind of have like this pre-work that I have my clients doing before we do the mineral protocol, because we're supporting things like their detox and drainage pathways, their lymphatic system, their liver, their kidneys, like all these other things that are going to help their body be more receptive to what we're doing with the mineral protocol. So I think that's the other piece too, is we're not just jumping straight into, now you're going to take all these minerals and everything's going to be okay. It's the lifestyle things that we just talked about. So it's the stress and the sleep and all that. Those things are crucial. And then it's supporting detox and drainage pathways to kind of prepare the body to be more receptive to the things that we want it to do, and kind of getting things out of the way to allow the body to heal. I am a full believer that the body has everything it needs to have to heal itself. It's just a lot of times we have to get things out of the way. We have to calm down the inflammation, the inflammatory state that it's in. And so I think supporting the detox and drainage pathways and all these other kind of things we're doing ahead of time is crucial before we add in the mineral protocol. So then we're adding in the minerals. And I find that, once my clients have kind of supported these things, their body's a little, and that being said too, there's also a very slow titration process. Like it's a whole, I think it usually takes my clients anywhere from 3 to 4 weeks to get up to the full dose of the mineral protocol. So we're slowly implementing this too. So again, we're not just throwing a bunch of crap at them and their body like freaks out, because that's happened before. So it's allowing the body, like implementing things slowly, allowing the body to receive what we're giving it. And then, from there, that's when, once we kind of get the mineral protocol underway, that's when I usually start addressing other things. So we're looking at, let's go back and look at some other things just on the Dutch test with, if there was estrogen or progesterone issues. We're looking at gut stuff. If there was, dysbiosis or, pathogens or something we have to address. I kind of start doing that once we've gotten the mineral protocol underway.
Okay. So, and I know we're going to run short on time because you've got another call, but I'm going to try and sum this up, right? And so when you're looking at somebody who's got health-related issues, one of the key things for you is you understand that the significance and the importance of the minerals has an influence potentially on multiple systems in the body. And so a different starting point for you is to say, how can I start to restore balance to the minerals? And then once I restore balance to the minerals, then I can start to look for some of the root causes as to why this person's got thyroid issues, adrenal issues, or whatever issues. Is that
right? Yep.
Is that fair to say?
Yep, I think that's fair. Yeah.
Got it. So, all right, we're going to run out of time. So I'm going to kind of we got to kind of deep and granular in there, because I'm trying to kind of figure out how you're going about the process and what you're doing. Because if somebody says, hey, I can take minerals, I just get an electrolyte drink and I'll take it. No big deal.
Yeah.
And then we need to make sure that they start to understand how it maybe relate to two of the systems that we only got to today. So if somebody wants to know more about you and what you do, and where can they find out more about you and is there a book? Is there a website? Where do they find out more about you?
Yeah, you can visit my website. It's hopefulandwholesome.com. It's got everything about me, what I do. You can find me on social media, mostly on Instagram at the Hope Pedraza. Best ways to get in touch and learn more.
Awesome. All right. Well, I know you've got a hard stop in a minute, so I'm going to let you go. Thanks for coming on the Thyroid Answers podcast. And, for the listeners, keep in mind that if you've got some chronic health issues, this is something we haven't talked about necessarily in depth in the past, is mineral imbalances and how they might be tied to problems in your overall health, problems with your thyroid gland, problem with the adrenal system. So, all right, we're going to sign off. Hope, thanks so much for coming on the podcast, and maybe we'll talk to you again, okay?
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.